Hi, my name is Christopher Donald. Thank you for joining me and my channel here. I'm going to be doing another segment of my series on the business of art. And this one is going to be about talking about studio production artists. So working as a production ceramicist as opposed to making work primarily for gallery sale, which is generally smaller numbers. Production artists are people who produce more volume in order to make enough income. If you watched the previous video about being a gallery artist and kind of what's involved politically and with that process, and it didn't seem like your kind of thing, if you're maybe a little more introverted than you think that type of work would require, this might be more for you. Most people who work doing production work you're basically self-employed, you're a small business owner, and you spend a lot of time alone, frankly. The stereotype with artists is that you're somehow going to a lot of parties, or you seem to have a lot of time on your hands. But all of the successful production artists that I know, they're just hard workers. They put in normal hours and they work really hard. They hustle for what they have. It's a fairly solitary job unless and until you can hire staff yourself to keep you company. Otherwise, it's pretty much you just working on your own. This path isn't one that most people really talk about very often. It's the less glamorous direction to go in generally for fine craft, and there's some controversy, at least in our industry, as far as there's a bit of a pall, a bit of a people are somewhat embarrassed about making money sometimes when it comes to the arts. I'm not quite sure why that is or where that comes from, but it's seen that if you're making a good living at it, that there's something somehow distasteful to that you're somehow selling out or doing something unsavory or not really making real work or making real art or real craft because you're actually able to pay the bills with it. And I'm really not sure where that's developed. It probably came out partly of the fight that we've had to have over the last several decades legitimizing craft as an art form in its own right, where before it was seen as a craft, as something more like carpentry, where it's a trade that you do for a living. But we fought very hard to get it recognized as a valid art form in its own right. So swinging back in the other direction, I think, rubbed some people the wrong way. But it's something that I've always liked about ceramics, is that ability to kind of just focus on the work and just making things, and how much I enjoy that process. So that's what production art is about. They're somewhere between commercial artists and gallery artists. Excuse me for the interruption. I'm going to get through this video if it kills me. It's my third phone call in a row. So I was saying that production artists are basically somewhere between a commercial artist and a studio artist, and that commercial artists are more seen as being people like industrial designers, graphic designers, illustrators, people who are creative on demand and are creative in order to fulfill a specific brief. So somebody hires you to do something for them. That is a commercial artist. And you're not entirely working from your own vision, let's put it that way. Where a production crafts person, you are making all of your own decisions. You decide what your product line is, you decide what you're making, you decide who you sell it to. So you don't really have that same outside influence on you that a commercial artist does. But you do need to be consistent. You do need to have great quality control. You need to deliver on time. You need to have really good people skills. at least as far as selling yourself and managing your business. As far as education, production artists, I would say that there is an advantage to having a formal education, to being traditionally or formally trained. That's my background, but there's also a lot to be said for having the experience of working within a production environment as well. And I was lucky enough to do internships while in school, getting a formal education in craft. So I got the best of both worlds. I would say that if you don't get the opportunity to be formally trained, there are definitely some processes, at least as far as creativity and your breadth of knowledge and not reinventing the wheel, that you would miss out on. But it's probably not the end of the world. There are probably more self-taught people doing production work than honestly there are people with formal educations. If you do get strictly a formal education, it is very much in your interest to do some kind of an internship while you're in school, and definitely once you get out, if you're thinking of hanging up your shingle and going into business for yourself. The knowledge that you get working in another person's production facility is invaluable, and you'll learn both information about what you want to do and what you don't want to do. And that can save you quite a bit of time once you launch your own business. The skills that you might not get if you're completely self-taught would be more accounting, business skills, marketing, public speaking. Those are the types of classes that you'd be more likely to take in college than, say, to do something on your own time. So where and how do production ceramicists work? Mostly you're going to be working out of a situation like your garage, your basement, a spare room. Hopefully, actually, you get to live and work in the same place. There's a massive cost advantage to double dipping and having the place where you live be able to be where you have your studio. Otherwise, you have to rent a studio space or acquire a studio space in some way. There are ways of doing that. Many people who teach part-time will get access to facilities as one of the perks. But it's difficult to do production work with those kinds of situations. You really want a certain amount of control over your environment and over your equipment, your firings, and all of that. And it's less likely you'll have that if it's just a bonus of a job that you're doing on the side. I would say that you're going to minimum, you should have 10 by 10 feet of space, but you're going to be real cramped real fast if that's all the room you have. 12 by 20 is probably more ideal. That would not include the space for your kilns, which is preferably outside. Really needs to be outside because even electric kilns are a safety hazard, and I would not put one even in an attached garage. I run one in a basement, but not comfortably, not feeling good about it. It isn't the infrastructure that's the issue. It's the fact that if a kiln malfunctions, it can burn your house to the ground. So it can kill you. It outgasses, so even if you're ventilating it properly, you're still going to have fumes getting into your house that you might not want. So preferably you're going to have some separate space. And you may have to rent it. If you do have to rent it, then that has to be included in your overhead costs and what you'll need to charge for your work and how much you'll need to do. So your customers. There are essentially two major tracks for production craftspeople. One is wholesaling and the other is retail. I would say most of us did some combination of the two. for me, it was like maybe an 80-20 split. Like 20% of my work was retail and 80% was wholesale. I know people who do nothing but wholesale. Let's go down the advantages and disadvantages of each one. So wholesaling, essentially you are taking orders, advance orders, and people pay, in advance a certain percentage in order to place that order, to hold that space with you. Mine was 50% of the order had to be paid up front, and I had delivery dates already set, and I would take my orders and then work, getting all of my pots made, and then deliver them, and then I get the rest of the payment. So with wholesale, you're able to pay your overhead and pay for your production costs from that deposit. And there's a big advantage to that. You don't have to take out like a short-term loan or anything to afford to actually make the work in the first place. There's also wholesale fairs, buyers markets, where you can, it's basically like an art fair, but only for businesses, where they come and they can see your work and place orders. Other than that, you're going to need to be going around selling yourself, maybe finding an art representative to help sell your work. But it's generally going to be like any small business, learning your market, learning where you can sell your work, and selling yourself, being a good salesperson and convincing people to buy your work. I feel like a lot of craft is actually an easier sell than, say, doing prints or fine artwork. I can make mugs that I've never had a problem selling mugs. Basically, everyone buys mugs. So in a pinch, I can pretty much make my entire living just making mugs. It gets I love mugs, and it gets a little boring after a while, but I could totally do it. I can sell mugs all day long. So I think it would be less easy if it weren't something that people use all the time and use every day and get attached to. So when you're selling retail, it's similar to wholesale as far as how you find markets. There are art fairs that you can do. You do have to pay in advance, up to a year in advance for some of them, the more prestigious ones. And a lot of them are juried, so it's not guaranteed that you're going to get into those fairs. Nowadays, there's online sales, so you can do Etsy, you can have your own website. Ceramics is uniquely difficult for mail order because it's fragile and it's heavy. And that's a nasty combination if you're going to be mailing things to people. Jewelers have it easy when it comes to shipping, but potters, we do not. So consider that as part of kind of your business model. I always recommend to people that they price the work that they sell in person as if they had to ship it to like Cuba. So you should essentially make the same money. You should charge the same money on the mug online or in person. In person, you just make more money, and that's great. But you should still be able to sell it and send it to somebody and not have to charge them more, or that much more than it really should cost locally. You can do private studio sales. There are artists that have 1 or 2 studio sales a year, and that is their entire income. You can do things like Renaissance festivals, depending on what kind of work you're making. Those are very lucrative. And wheel throwers are one of the crafts where we're a little bit flashy to watch. So it's great if you can actually do demonstrations or have someone else helping to do demonstrations for things like Renaissance festivals or art fairs, because you can pull in a crowd, and people are genuinely always more interested in buying your work if they've seen you make it. So it is a big advantage. Nowadays, social media is, of course, something that you have to be good at. I would say that if you're thinking of hanging up your shingle and kind of going to work for yourself, you should be starting to get good at that pretty early in college. You want to start having a blog, making it so that people can really connect with you, see you as an interesting person, an interesting story. They can follow your journey. They can follow your creative development. People love that. And the better you are at that kind of thing, That's fantastic. It's really going to help you. And part of that social media experience is going to help you develop a network. Your network is both your customers and the people who help support you. It could be a mentor, it could be other colleagues, may not be. Potters, when they start to really make money at it, we are a solitary folk. Not a lot of cooperation at a certain level, but earlier on you'll experience more cooperation. Later it's competition, which is just human nature. So your network, as someone who is essentially self-employed in a small business, it's important that you try not to become isolated, which is very difficult to do because you're going to be spending a lot of long hours alone, essentially working. You need feedback from someone. You need to have a trusted ear. You need to be able to not allow your creative process to stagnate. And that can be a problem if you start selling successfully. Often you get into a rut because I make widget A. Everyone loves widget A. I will make more of widget A. I will never make any other version of widget A because I'm afraid that people won't like it as much, and I'll stop selling and I'll get evicted and my kids won't have food. So it's tough. The more you become reliant on this income, the more trapped you can get in your creative process. And so you should always hold a little piece of yourself out. There should always be some new work coming in, even when you're doing popular work. That keeps it fresh for you. It keeps it fresh for your audience. You never know when they could turn on something that's been successful up until now. Suddenly it's not. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Anyway, so your network are the people who support you, your friends, your family, your loved ones, colleagues, mentors, anyone like that, as well as your customers and the businesses that buy your work. And you need to maintain relationships and contacts with the people within your network. You need to know when people's birthdays are. You need to know, you need to support the stores. So if there's a store that sells your work, you find out when they have things that they want people to come to, and you push your network towards their network. So you tell your followers, oh, this place, they handle my work and they're having a fantastic event. I'm not going to be there, but they have all these other great things. You need to help promote those people because they're helping to promote you. Your workforce. So at first, it's pretty much you. Your workforce is you. And there's some issues with that. Let's talk about that a little bit. In my video about pricing, I talk about needing to make sure you have insurance and things like that. And especially at the beginning of this small business, you are the bottleneck. You are the weak link. If you go down, you are making no money. So when it's just you, you can't get injured, you can't get sick, you can't have a bad day. One of the differences between being a hobbyist and an enthusiast and being a professional craftsperson is that I can make work all the time, and it has no bearing on how I feel about it. I can be having the worst day in the world, and I can make work. So I have separated my artistic process from my emotional state. And that's something you actually have to learn how to do. It can be really difficult. You hear people talking about how, oh, you just have a bad day. And it's true, especially when you're first learning how to wheel throw, there's days you just can't throw. But if you're required to make money on those days, what's your fallback? And when you're developing your business plan for this small business, you need to consider what happens when I'm sick, what happens when I'm hurt, what happens if I'm just not feeling it, what happens if I have a problem with my deliveries, with my supply chain, if I can't get the clay I'm used to, if I can't get my glaze materials. Should I, if I have extra money, stock up on certain things? where do I keep them if I stock up on certain things? You actually need to have like disaster planning, disaster recovery planning for your business, which involves all kinds of different things. And it's best to think about them rather than to just kind of stick your head in the sand and assume I'm young, I'm healthy, and it's all going to work out fine. Um, we've been experiencing in the industry some pretty major upheavals with material availability. Certain materials are just gone now. And there are people who stockpiled just truckloads of certain things. And they're like, yeah, well, I'm going to be okay for the next 10 years. But then after that, I don't know what's going to happen. I won't be able to get that anymore. And that's something to consider. So your workforce at the beginning is you. Hopefully, eventually, if it makes sense for your business, you will expand your workforce. You will hire other people. You might take on interns or residents. You might hire part-time or full-time staff. And you should be creating a business model where you can grow into that, and that will make financial sense for you. Those other people are also part of your support structure as far as avoiding injury, avoiding health problems, and avoiding burning yourself out. It's going to be one of the biggest hurdles, especially for the first couple of years, is you have to learn how to work smart. You have to learn how to be efficient. And you need to learn how to keep yourself from despair and to do it all in a vacuum for the most part. You're doing it all alone. So that support network that you have is very important, especially for the first couple of years. Teaching. So a lot of times people look at teaching as being the kind of the Hail Mary, their parachute that will help them and save them if they're a production artist. Up to a certain point that can be true. Teaching is not an easy way out. Teaching is a profession all in of itself, and it's its own skill and it's its own training. And I personally feel like a lot of people who are teaching shouldn't be teaching because they're teaching for the wrong reasons. They're teaching because they need some extra money. But when I look at how influential my early teachers were in my creative development, it often gets me to a point as a teacher myself where I'm immobilized with fear over what I could do potentially to my students. I have quirks and tics and habits as an artist that I can trace back to teachers I had when I was 7. My view of art and of what a potter is based entirely on my first professional ceramics teachers. So you are, as a teacher, highly influential on this upcoming generation of artists, and it's a very serious, it's a serious privilege to have, to be able to influence and mold that generation of creatives. And you should not do it for just extra money. There's far better ways to make extra money. And some people are doing it basically for access to equipment, access to supplies. At a certain point, that it can become a detriment rather than a benefit. You are going to need to control your own destiny at some point as a small business owner and not kind of glom onto another small business to survive. I think some of it is fine, but honestly, if you're teaching, especially if you're doing it right, is all-encompassing. It can be very tiring, very exhausting, very draining. And if you're teaching the very thing that you're also trying to do as your job, it can be very difficult because you'll use up your reserves teaching, and then you swear you're going to go home and you're going to do this work, and you can't because you're burned out. If you have to have a straight job, something to help support this, I would encourage you to make it a white-collar job and to make it something that will not burn you out creatively or physically, because you can't afford to let that happen and still be able to run your business. Pricing. So I have a whole separate hour-long video on pricing, and that's almost all I'm going to say about it. Check that video out as far as needing to think about pricing. The one thing that I don't go into in great detail in that video is figuring out your own product line, but that's because everyone's situation is so inherently different and unique that I would need to work with someone one-on-one specifically in order to help them develop a product line or think about what they should do to buffer themselves. I'll give you some basics though. You should understand that 80% of what you sell will probably be under $60. That's most of your money. You should make sure that you have things that don't rely on you to be wheel throwing as a product. So that could be something which is molded. It could be something that's made with a jigger or a jolly, which are a plaster mold and a rotating like a knife that either jiggers are something like a plate mold where the knife comes down on the outside of the mold. The mold shapes the front face of the plate and the knife forms the back of the plate. Jollies are something where it's like an internal mold, like a bowl, and the knife comes into the bowl and forms the inside, while the mold is forming the outside of the bowl. So that's jiggers and jollies. And those don't rely on the same physical strength as wheel throwing does. You could have some kind of hand building, some kind of extruded thing. You could just make sure that you try and be good about taking care of your health, stretching, exercising, spacing out your work week so that you don't throw 3 days in a row, 4 days in a row, and just injure yourself. Just things like that. And while we're talking about health, do not throw sitting. You need to throw standing. Throwing sitting will absolutely destroy your back and shorten your career, or destroy it. So I want to avoid that. Anyhow, hopefully, I mean, the whole point of this series is to just have a candid conversation with you guys as far as my experiences and my what I've seen and what I know is going on out there and what I've done professionally. And I don't think it does anyone any good to sugarcoat things. I don't want to make things sound horrifying either. I enjoy craft. I enjoy making things with my hands. I have the right persona for it, the right personality. But there are, with any profession, with any calling, with any small business, you're going to have some bad days, and you're going to have some times when you're not sure you made the right choice. And hopefully you've got a network there to kind of buoy you up and help you reset. But just because it's something that we love and it's something that we come to from a passionate place doesn't mean that it's not a job. So if you can kind of straddle that line between, you know, your passion and just paying the bills, then you've probably got the right personality for this kind of thing. And I would highly encourage you to talk to any studio artists that you can, as far as people who do production work. They'll be harder to find than the gallery people. Every store that you see when you're on vacation, like oceanside kind of gallery shops, all those kinds of things, like in museums, the museum shop work, all that's made by artists, by production studio artists, most of whom are never going to be on the cover of Ceramics Monthly, that you'll probably never know who they are, and who, you know, put their kids through college doing this sort of thing. They make far, far more money at it than the gallery artists do. They don't have any of the notoriety, but they actually make the money. So anytime you get a chance to talk to any of those folks or run them down, again, most of them work in a vacuum and don't see a lot of people. So they'd probably be really happy to chat with you about what they do. People like to talk about what they like. So I'd encourage you to reach out. If you go to a conference like NCECA, you'll run into those folks there often. Not as they are a much smaller number at NCECA than the gallery folks and the teachers and the students, but they're there. So you can kind of look for those workshops, look for those insights. Anyhow, so hopefully some of this information's been helpful and not too depressing. and I don't want to ruin your journey. It's good to be passionate, but it's also good to know what you might be in for. So please subscribe, and you'll get notified for new content as it drops. And there will be more conversations in this series. There's a lot to talk about the business of art, and not just the creative side of it. So thanks for joining me, and I'll see you back here soon. Bye.